In this video, I want to introduce for loops and a data type that's often used with for loops, which is the range data type. So before I get to range, let me introduce for loops with respect to these data types we've already talked about: strings, lists, tuples, and sets. So let me just evaluate this cell. So it's going to define all four of these variables. And say I want to go through, let's start with my list, because I think that's a little easier than my string. Say I want to go through these four elements in my list, and say I want to print them out. Then the most natural way to do that is to use a for loop. So I'm going to say for, and then this can be any variable name I want, like let's call it x, for x in my list, and then let's print x. And so this is the syntax for for loops. It goes for, then variable name, then in, and then the thing you want to iterate over. Okay, where iterate over means go through each element in it one at a time. And then we have a colon here, and then it's important to indent. Okay, I think technically it's supposed to be four spaces, but I never find myself tapping four spaces. The indentation just happens automatically for me in Jupyter Notebook when I hit tab. So, or after a colon like this, like I'm not going to hit tab, it's just automatically going to indent. So print X. Okay, and then I think that does what you'd expect. The reason I said I thought this was maybe easier than my string is I think it would be very possible to expect that for X in my string would maybe print hello and then it would print world, but that's not how we iterate through a string in Python. It's very similar to the indexing from before, where we go through the 0th character, the first character, and so on. And these characters, they are all strings themselves. It's not like it's a different data type. So let me try to convince you of that. And so if I want two things to happen inside of this repeated part of the for loop, then I have to be sure to also have the second thing indented. So whatever is indented in after the for loop, that is what gets repeated as we go through my string. So like, let's say print type of X. And so I sort of wish it would just say str instead of this class str, but that's just the way Python prints this type of str. So I don't think it's worth trying to get around that. So anyway, this letter H, it is also a string. It's a little string of length 1. If I do print length of X, okay, so first X is equal to capital H. It's of type string. The length of X is 1. Okay, then X is equal to E. E is of type string. E has length 1, and so on. And let me show you what would happen if I change the indentation here. So one way I can do that is I can highlight both of these lines, hold down Shift and hit Tab. And so now this is the part that's going to be repeated. And then this part is going to happen at the very end when we get to this D in Hello World. Okay, so then at the very end here, once we've finished the for loop, okay, this D is the last print X here. And then X is still equal to this letter D. And so now outside of the for loop, so it only happens once, we see that D is of type string and D has length 1. Okay, good. And this the same thing also works for my tuple and my set. So my tuple 3141, my set. And then let me just remind you how my set was defined. It was defined curly brackets, so that was what made it a set, 3141. And so I wasn't sure when I did this what order it would go in. I don't think I at least don't think you should expect or base any functionality around it going in a particular order, even if maybe each time you do it, it's going to be the same. And uh, Another thing I want you to notice is that only printed this 1 twice, because if we look at my set, only has these 3 elements in it. Okay, great. So that's a little introduction to for loops, but the name that I want to give this section is ranges and for loops. So what is a range? And say, for example, we want to print hello world. Say we want to print it 5 times. Then we can do for, I'll call it I. You could keep calling it X if you want, but I'm used to calling it I when that stands for an index. For I in range 5, print, let's just go ahead and type it out, hello world. Okay, so that does this 5 times. These ranges, they're very similar to the slices we were doing before, where we had those colons. Here we can do similar things. So for example, I could say for I in range, let's say 2 to 10, go up by 3. And let's print I. So we go 2, then up by 3 to 5, then up by 3 to 8. What if we did 10 to 3, go by -1? Then we have 10, 9, 8. And remember that the right endpoint is usually not included. So that's why this 3 does not show up here. And this range, it is not just like some specific Python syntax with respect to for loops. Hey, it's actually a data type on its own. And in general, there's like a seemingly unlimited number of data types in Python. And so far, all of these that I've introduced are worth remembering and worth like being comfortable with that data type. But at some point, you're just going to get used to the fact that, okay, here is a data type that exists, but we're not going to use any special properties of that particular data type. So later on, I'll try to remember to point out some data types like that, like, oh, this is a different data type, but we don't need any special properties of it. And so what was I trying to say here? Well, let's call this my range equals range 10, 3, -1. And so let's see what's the type of my range. So that's its own thing. You're never going to be able to get like 3, 1, 4, 1 into a range because they always follow some regular pattern where it starts somewhere. You specify like what it should not go past or like hit exactly, and then you specify the step size. So my range, what is it? It doesn't print out the elements unless you like explicitly tell it to, for example, using one of these for loops. Another example, say I do about my range 2 equals range 1000. And we can do a lot of similar things to this as, or let's do 3 to 1000. We can do a lot of similar things to this as what we can do to an ordinary list or tuple. For example, I can say my range 2, give me the 0th element in there. Oops, my range 2. It starts at 3. I can say give me the last element in my range 2 using this -1 abbreviation. And remember, it doesn't hit the right endpoint. So I didn't specify the step size here, but step size is assumed to be 1 if you don't specify it. Another example, you could do my range 2, and then I could say, give me from the 10th to the 100th, go up by 4. And if you stare at this, maybe you can convince yourself that if you start at the 10th, go up to the 100th, and go up by 4, that is the same. Okay, within this range from 3 to 1000 up by 1, that's the same as starting at 13, go up to 103, go up by 4. So maybe last one I'll do, length of my range 2. And I'm sure this is either going to be 997 or 998. I think it'll be 997 because it's not going to include this last one. Let's check. Yep. So this length is 997. And the point of this isn't that we're going to do a lot of like slicing with range objects or indexing with range objects. Mostly we'll use range objects in conjunction with for loops, like especially something like this where we just want to repeat a certain number of times. So why did I spend a couple minutes talking about this indexing and slicing? It was just to emphasize that even though it's its own data type, these range data types share a lot of the same functionality as strings and as tuples and as lists. Maybe not with sets because sets do not allow this kind of indexing.